Daniel 2 through 7 was written in Aramaic. So now Daniel chapter 8, as we begin chapter 8, it'll begin in Hebrew again. And one of the things that's curious and why people separate chapter 1 with chapters 2 through 7 by the language is that chapter 7, if you remember, is Daniel's first vision. And he wrote his first vision in Aramaic. And now we come just 2 years later, after that first vision, Daniel has a second vision. And this one's not written in Aramaic, it's written in Hebrew. So that's part about why people tend to divide this section from 8 to 12 as saying this is a section that deals more about the future, what is to come as it pertains to Israel. Whereas chapters 2 through 7, they often say, being written in Aramaic, it was a language that would be understood not only by the Israel, but by Babylonians and other people in the world, that it was a message God had for his people, but also for the world, about the future as well, for the world as well. And so beginning in chapter 8, we'll begin reading here, first few verses. It says, "It's in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam." I'll just pause there for a second, because just a few things to explain from the setting. And really, as I thought about this, the section from Daniel 8 all the way to section 12, one of the things that I mentioned briefly, but we didn't read the passage, was if you remember back in Daniel chapter 6, when Daniel was praying, he prayed 3 times a day, and it said that he prayed toward Jerusalem. And I think there's an understanding of, if you read in 2 Chronicles, this is a passage that was referenced back then, but in 2 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles chapter 9, and it's beginning in verse 36, sorry, really small numbers on my phone. Beginning in verse 36, and this speaks a little bit, I think, of why Daniel was praying towards the city of Jerusalem. And this is during the dedication of the temple that this is being mentioned. And it says in 2 Chronicles chapter 9, or chapter 6, verse 36, it says, "If they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you are angry with them, and give them to an enemy, so that they are carried away captive to a land far or near. Yet if they turn their heart in the land to which they have been carried captive, and repent and plead with you in the land of their captivity, saying, 'We have sinned and have acted perversely and wickedly,' if they repent with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their captivity to which they were carried captive, and pray toward this land which you gave to their fathers, the city that you have chosen, and the house that I have built for your name, then hear from heaven your dwelling place their prayer and their pleas, and maintain their cause and forgive your people who have sinned against you." So I think one of the things that's conveyed by Daniel's action in praying towards Jerusalem is part of this 2 Chronicles, where he's praying passionately for his people to return, to repent, to follow after God so that they could be restored. Just like it says there, if these people would turn and pray towards this land, towards this city, towards this temple, it's all being relayed in there. It's saying, if they would pray towards that and repent and desire to follow God, then God would heal them, would restore them. And so I think this is part of the understanding that we have of Daniel, of 3 times a day he's praying, and he's praying for his people. He's praying for this restoration. And so I think how that fits into chapters 8 through 12, I think because of that continuous prayer of Daniel, and I think this comes through even in Daniel chapter 10, where things are mentioned regarding Daniel. I think that comes across as saying, because Daniel had this continual prayer in such a way to see this restoration of Israel, to see Israel return, even though they weren't at the time. I think that's in part why you see this vision given to Daniel to say, God wanted to show Daniel, saying, there is a plan for Israel. You're praying this. your prayers are not being answered per se as far as Israel returning and them being restored. But I think in some ways, Daniel's chapters 8 through 12 is God showing to Daniel an answer to his many prayers of saying, this is, you're not going to see the prayers while you're alive, but to give him an idea of the vision, to say, these are the plans I have for Israel of what will happen to their future, because he's praying constantly for his people in such a way. But anyways, I think that gives some prelude to chapters 8 through 12 and why, there's an Israel focus and why Daniel gets these visions, why God reveals this, and why God chooses to do this. So anyways, we get in here in the third year of Belshazzar. We mentioned again who Belshazzar was. He's the son of Nabonidus. And we actually find in the Babylonian Chronicle a reference not necessarily to the name Belshazzar, but the name there is Belshar-Usur, which they believe is the same name as Belshazzar. It's just how they wrote it versus how the Hebrews people wrote it. And so it mentions in the Babylonian Chronicle that in the third year of Nabonidus, that's when he appoints Belshar-Usur, co-regent of Babylon, and that's then marks the time in which he's going to leave Babylon and go live in some other city away. He had other plans. He was kind of like going to be an absentee king at that point, and so he's setting up his son, his eldest son, to be in charge of things, really. And so that's kind of how people, they call him king. And we discussed some of that before. So that happens anyways in the year, in 556 is when Nabonidus becomes king. So it's believed in 553, that's when he's appointed as co-regent. Well, it's not believed, but that's what the Babylon Chronicle mentions, that's the third year, the 553 BC. And so this is thought to be in 551 BC, the time of this vision, which is the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar. Daniel would be 69 years old, so of course it's quite a bit different from when he first arrived, 15 years old. And he's been, as it says elsewhere, he's been working pretty much within, for the king and in some appointed place ever since, pretty much just about ever since he got there. It says that he's in there. In chapter 1, you see that he's there up until the time of Cyrus, that he's still in an appointed place working there. So the other thing about this is it mentions that this vision that he has, that he was in Susa. And, a number of things say that this vision, it seems like the vision took place where it was in Susa. He didn't actually go to Susa physically. He was in Babylon. Susa was not really probably a part of Babylon. It was actually a part of Persia. And some of the things remarkable about Susa is that it would become, it wasn't at this time, but it would become a royal city, a place where the kings would live. And we see under Cyrus that he established that. It's also the archaeological location where they found the Code of Hammurabi, which is, I guess, a little side note. And it's also the place where, when you read in the book of Esther, that's the place where the book of Esther takes place. It's in the citadel of Susa, where King Xerxes was. So, that's some of the background. So it's very much a Persian-centered, centered city, much like Babylon is for the Babylonian Empire. And from that perspective of, now being based in Persia, this is the vision that he's going to see. And he says, I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had two horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. And, one of the things I just remarked by seeing this is, as we begin this section in Daniel, there's a lot of specifics that are given regarding the Medo-Persian Empire and also regarding the Greek Empire. And a lot of these specifics really what causes people, who are doubting the authenticity of Daniel being written at this time, this causes a lot of problems for them, because if someone was really in 550 BC writing this about events that would transpire, this was, somewhat of the near future, but then later on you see stuff that's hundreds of years later, and there's a lot of specifics about those things. That's part of the reason why there's a lot of focus on people thinking, can Daniel, maybe it's not really the Daniel of this day that wrote it, it's a later Daniel. And so part of it is trying to understand there's so many different specifics. I think someone who likes history would get a lot out of these chapters of seeing all the specific events mentioned and how they're fulfilled in history. And we're going to go over some of those things as well, just in the section that we just covered regarding the ram. Because as we know, the ram is, of course, the Medo-Persian Empire. That's even mentioned here in this chapter. That's also what we mentioned, saying, this ram has characteristics of the beast in that image. In chapter 7, the beast, where, it had one side raised up. But anyways, it mentions these two horns, and just to give a little background on one rose above the other, Media was a major power, more powerful than Persia in the beginning. It was a power that helped Babylonian defeat Assyria, actually, back in 612 BC. And Persia became great under King Cyrus. So it's during this time that you see Persia become greater, and it fulfills this part of the one horn rising above the other. It also mentions it charged west, north, and south, which corresponded to conquests that King Cyrus had. And to the west, there was Babylonian, Syrian, and Asia Minor, where he conquered, a number of areas in that region. He went north to Armenia. He went south to Egypt and Ethiopia. So again, all these specifics of where his conquests were are kind of mentioned before he even started any of these conquests here in Daniel. Next, we're going to move on to the goat, and we're going to read that in chapters 5 through 8. And it says, "And as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal. And he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns towards the 4 winds of heaven." So we have kind of like the synopsis. The goat is identified as Greece, which I guess if someone says the goat came from the west and they're identifying it as Medo-Persian Greece, it's kind of like a no-brainer there. The goat would have to come from the west, because that's where Greece is. But, we do see this fulfillment much later. Again, this was around 550 BC, the time of the vision. This doesn't happen for over 200 years. 334 BC is when Alexander the Great comes and moves against the Persians. Of course, we recognize Alexander the Great to be the great horn. It makes sense. The ram had no power to stand. The other thing is, again, for those that like history, there's a number of battles that Alexander has against the Persians. There's actually 3 major encounters. In each of those major encounters, he is outnumbered, and he wins. Basically, there's these 3 battles you could read about, the Battle of Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela. Gaugamela takes place near Nineveh, but basically, it's in the Asia Minor, and then in the middle, and then you have farther to the east. But in each of these battles, he becomes victorious, even though outnumbered. And basically, by this 3rd battle, they're completely broken. And so they've basically conquered the Medo-Persian Empire at the conclusion of this. They don't really have a force that can try to resist them after all that. And so you see that carried out, that they really had no power to stand. They didn't really wage a war in which they were successful in any way against Alexander. It says, then when strong, the horn was broken, which also we know about Alexander the Great. When he was still young, when he was on his way returning from these conquests, that's when he dies. He becomes ruler at the age of 20, and then as he's returning from these conquests at the age of 31, he dies. And that leaves his kingdom to be divided eventually among four of his generals. There's Cassander, it has the four mentioned here: Cassander, Lysimaeus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. These, I don't know, there's a period of time in which they, do this struggle to figure out who becomes the people who would rule. But yeah, it becomes divided in this way where some people have said, it kind of corresponds with the four different directions. There's a west area, a north, an east area, and a south area. But these are the four main subdivisions that come out of the Grecian Empire. And then it goes on to talk about this little horn, beginning in verse 9. And it says, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the east and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host, and some of the stars, stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him. And the place of his sanctuary was overthrown, and a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of the transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, for how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. So getting into this one a little bit again, when it says out of the little horns, there is, first of all, when we get to this section of the little horn, there are different interpretations that people have. And I think part of that isn't maybe necessarily regarding what you read here in the vision, but what follows regarding Gabriel and the interpretation that he gives to the vision makes people question, like, wait, is that really the right understanding? But I'm going to start off by saying, this is, a common understanding of how this vision of the little horn does fit something that happened in history already. And so there's this guy by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. He's the 8th ruler of the domain of Seleucus. Seleucus, again, that's one of the 4 regions that the Grecian Empire was split into. And when it says that grew towards the south and the east and the glorious land, well, to the south, it mentions that Antiochus did make gains in Egypt. He did have conquest to make some gains of land towards Egypt. He also had conquest in Armenia to the east and so forth. So it kind of fits that south and east. And also says the glorious land. The glorious land is interpreted to mean Israel, the glorious land. And so he did exercise full dominion over the land of the Jews at that time. It talks about how he threw down some of the hosts and the stars, and it just, for this, it does mention how he did persecute God's people and kill them. There's actually the book of Maccabees that gives a lot of details about this time. And in that book of Maccabees, there's just, a few different excerpts. And we're just going to read a few of them here. And it says, and after 2 years' time, the king, Antiochus, sent his chief collector of tribute unto the cities of Judah. And he came unto Jerusalem with a great multitude, and he spake words of peace unto them in deceit, and they gave him credence. And he fell suddenly upon the city, and smote it very sore, and destroyed much people of Israel. And when he had taken the spoils of the city, he set it on fire, and pulled down the houses and the walls thereof round about. And the women and children took away captive, and took possession of the cattle. And many of the people were gathered unto them, every one that forsook the law, and they committed evils in the land, and drove the Israelites into hiding places, wherever they could find a refuge. And on the 15th day of the month, in the 140th and 5th year, they built an abomination of desolation upon the altar, which was basically an altar to Zeus, and built altars in the cities of Judah round about, and they burnt incense at the doors of their houses and in their streets, and having rent in pieces the books of the law which they found, they burnt them with fire. And where there was found with any a book of the covenant, or if it was found pleasure in the law, the king's commander or the king's commandment was that they should put him to death. Thus they did according to their might unto the Israelites every month, to as many as were found in the cities. And on the 25th day of the month, they sacrificed upon the altar, which was upon the altar of burnt offering. And according to the commandment, they put to death women and had caused their children to be circumcised. Children to be circumcised. And they hanged the infants about their necks, and plundered their houses, and slew them that had circumcised them. So one of the things we do see, Antiochus, this becomes a very bad time within Israel's history, where there's a lot of persecution, where the temple is desecrated, where those that are following after the law are being killed. So even as it mentions there regarding circumcision. So when it says threw down some of the hosts and the stars, I mean, that's some of the interpretation people can see there is that, this hosts and the stars, this represents God's people. People say, hosts and stars, that sometimes represents angels. In other words, though, people do refer to Genesis in a way, when God talks to Abraham about, his sons, his ancestors will be as many as the stars. Some do make reference to that, say, this the hosts and the stars that it's mentioning could be in some way referencing that, and it's thought that, we're talking about God's people that he threw down, that he trampled on. And he took away the regular burnt offering, just like it says there, throws truth to the ground. One of the things Antiochus wanted to do is he wanted the Israelites to be more like Greeks. He wanted them to worship the Greek gods, to practice the Greek sorts of sort of their ceremonies and so forth. So he was trying to get rid of any way in which they practiced after, the Judea's traditions, and so that they would act more like the Greeks. So anyways, we see with all these things that it seems like Antiochus does fulfill this. There's also this mention of 2,300 evenings and mornings. Antiochus, as I put up there at the top, he ruled from 175 to 164 BC. There's a number of events that people said that could explain the 2,300 evenings and mornings. That's almost a period of 7 years, just about. But they said back in 171 BC, you have Onias, the high priest, is murdered, and there's these pseudo-priests that take over after that. They're not real priests, but they try to act like they're priests. And then later on in 167 BC, that's when it mentions there's this altar to Zeus that's erected in the temple. And this altar to Zeus does actually cause a revolt among some of the people. The revolt does culminate in December 25, 165 BC, of them purging things from the temple and cleansing it. This is also what becomes known as the time of Hanukkah, what they celebrate with Hanukkah, this time in which the temple was restored. And then later on, in 164 BC, it says Antiochus dies. So in some way, we don't know the exact timeline of some of these things, but it's thought that this period of time is roughly found within these types of events of 2,300 evenings and mornings till the sanctuary is restored. There's also alternative types of ones, and we're going to get into that because that gets into the next section, which is really about the interpretation. Because after all this, it seems like, for the most part, you see that this does fit this time of history. And then you get into the interpretation. And it says, starting in 15, it says, "When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the later end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end." So there's a few things here where you're like saying, okay, Gabriel is saying this vision refers to the time of the end. He says that twice. It also talks about the end of the indignation. And so when people hear this sort of language, commonly people would think more like what we see in Revelation, right? So people, you say, well, it seems like Antiochus fulfills this vision, but then Gabriel comes along and gives understanding to Daniel, and he starts talking about these things as if, well, actually this vision pertains to the time of the end. And actually when it says later end of the indignation, it's not really clear there that that's really talking about the end. It could talk about the end. It could also be talking about the end of which God is now punishing Israel for their continued disobedience. So there is sort of an understanding where it's like, well, it's possible that it's not referring to the time of the end as far as when we think of the time of the end, but the time of the end in which, Israel suffers from their disobedience. So anyways, it's an interesting thing because of the language used here, people have trouble understanding, like, wait, does Gabriel have more insight about this than what we kind of understand about this? And does this in some way possibly refer to the time of the end? So anyways, because of this, there's a number of different difficulties people have in saying, is this truly fully fulfilled through Antiochus? Is it partially or mostly fulfilled and then some part? So anyways, I just mentioned that because there's a lot of speculation and difficulty in understanding it. Of course, then we go into chapters or verses 20 to 22, which are the ram and the goat, which mentioned Medo, Persia, Greece. These are things that were like, well, yeah, we kind of understand these things. And then he begins in verse 23, and it begins to talk, seemingly, more about this little horn. And so, beginning in verse 23, it says, and at the later end of their kingdom, which is it was just talking about the Greek kingdom and how 4 kingdoms shall arise from this nation, but not with his power. And it says, at the later time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. Again, it's possible this refers to Antiochus still. We're not sure how well he understood riddles, though, so we're quite not sure with that. But it says, his power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction and shall succeed in what he does. So again, we're like saying, well, not by his own power. There is some sort of allusions to the little horn of chapter 7. But the problem is the little horn of chapter 7 is with the 4th beast. And Greece is really represented by the 3rd beast. So again, that's why there's some confusion here, because they're saying a lot of the things that's being talked about here seem to make reference to what's talked about with that little horn, and also what's talked about in Revelation with the Antichrist. So anyways, it goes on, it says, by his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, which was still true. He did make deceit prosper. He tried to promote the Greek gods and tried to have Israel follow after that. And in his own mind he shall become great, sure. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. So this last part where it says, he shall go against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand, that's the part where we're saying, is this, some of the problems is trying to truly understand everything that happened about Antiochus' downfall. Because you're saying, well, there was an uprising of Jews. It wasn't that they killed him, though. Antiochus was down going against, he was battling against Media, I believe, when it says that he died. But again, it might make reference to that he was maybe not struck by human hand, maybe he was killed by God. Of course, this whole thing of not by human hand, we know that's kind of very much with the Antichrist. Antichrist is struck down by Jesus Christ. He speaks, and he's struck down, so it's not by human hand. So anyways, there's a lot of allusions, though, to the Antichrist in some of this stuff. And it says, and the vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. But seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And one of the things some people have done that, again, it's part of this desire, I think, to see how this might still be fulfilled as future, like part of this stuff fulfilled as future, is when they take the 2300 evenings, mornings and evenings, or evenings and mornings, 2300 evenings and mornings. Instead of saying these are each a day, it says, well, it's 2300 evenings and mornings, like separately. So that's 1,150 evenings and 1,150 mornings, which then gets you a point that's closer to the 3.5-year span and so forth. So anyways, I just mentioned this stuff because some of this stuff's a little confusing in this section. But I think one of the main things is we do know that's talking about Greece and Persia, Medo-Persia. It does seem like Antiochus and Epiphanes of Antiochus Epiphanes, is that his name? I gotta go back. Antiochus Epiphanes. I don't know. That last name still gets me because I'm like, Epiphanes, don't you have an epiphany? His name's Epiphanes. So anyways, it does seem like these things are fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes. And some of the language that Gabriel uses here, I don't know. Some ways when I look at it, Gabriel saw things differently than how we see the things. We also see that later on when he talks about the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece that he contends with. So I definitely see, that Gabriel has a perspective on this, and God has a perspective on this that we don't fully understand maybe as well. Like who was the power that helped promote Antiochus to be able to do this? Maybe in some ways it is an illusion. And maybe Antiochus does in some way foreshadow the Antichrist in such a way. Like there's a connection there. The ones that would, Satan or the host there that promote the Antiochus into his place of power, which, God doesn't prevent, that God has as part of a plan for how he would use. And maybe that's the same sort of power that Gabriel's thinking of when he says how there's allusions to things. But anyways, I'd say with all these things, there's basically a number of different interpretations, I think, because of this, where some people would say, well, this stuff this little horn doesn't refer to Antiochus. It refers to the Antichrist. But if someone says that, there's a lot of problems because you're like, well, this is from the Greek Empire. So for that to be true, then it would just have to mean that the Antichrist comes from one of these regions, but it's really not from the Greek Empire. It's from a later empire, which is that other beast. So I don't know. There's no matter what way you do it, it becomes a little troublesome when you read some of this stuff. But it seems like the best understanding, I don't know the best, but one understanding that I would have, though, is, again, that these things are pretty much fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes, even if I don't understand everything in some of what Gabriel says. But yeah, I also think it does, in a way, foreshadow the Antichrist, because we do see a lot of similarities here with what the Antichrist will be like in Revelation. So anyways, in conclusion of all these things, as we just wrap up here, one of the thoughts, again, is that I had is we're reading this and we're like, great, there's events that happened here. We're not part of these events, but it did make me think a little bit about, once more, the main thought is Daniel is someone who's constantly praying for his people. And God, out of great love for Daniel, is revealing to him, that there's terrible things that are still going to wait. But at the end, I think it somehow mimics, in certain ways, Daniel 7, because when Daniel wanted to ask about the fourth beast and the four horns and the little horn, Gabriel gave him, it wasn't necessarily Gabriel, but he was given an answer to those things. And then he was given an answer that he didn't ask, which was once more that, but their kingdom will come to an end, and God's kingdom will reign forever. And so I think in some of these things, God's trying to reveal to Daniel that says, even though you don't see that there's going to be worse times ahead for your people, for the people of Israel, but he did want to show Daniel that God still had a plan of getting rid of these things, just like restoring the temple, that things would be, in a way, to restore Israel, to teach them to follow after God. So I don't know. I mean, in all that, some of the things I got out of it was there's great persistence in prayer that I think Daniel shows that brings about, I think, part of the vision. Daniel praying 3 times a day for his people in such a way. And I think that's part of what God rewards Daniel with, his constant, persistent prayer. He reveals this vision to him. And the other things I just thought was, again, if someone loves history, this is a great thing. I didn't know much about Hanukkah. This is a lot more that I got to know maybe about Hanukkah. I haven't read the whole book of Maccabees, but that's kind of interesting then to read about this time in Israel's history where, they went through this great struggle and that which God then was able to end it. But I don't know if there's other things you guys can think of, that's great. But otherwise, I'm just going to close down in prayer, and maybe if there's something else you can think of that you get out of this section, chapter 8, please tell me about it. Interested in knowing what other insights you might have. But we close in prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you once more for your word. We thank you for your faithfulness to Daniel, to Israel, to not only give them times of difficulties so that they might turn to you, but also a time of restoration. We thank you once more for Daniel being an example to us, an example of prayer, example of persistence, example of faithfulness. May we also desire to be more like Daniel in this way and also have that confidence in you that you are in control of all things.